The ancient poet Virgil died of a fever with his masterwork still unfinished, and it was left to his executors to finish that book. The book was the Aeneid, and it would be, in its time, the definitive work on the founding myths and the stories of the Roman state. This would cement his role as the greatest poet of his day, and it's a legacy that's never died. Virgil is still read today. But the stories he told were his own adaptations. His version of Orpheus was different from that of Homer and Euripides. He wasn't even retelling the story as much as he was inventing it. And he was followed by Ovid, a poet who was born in his own lifetime. And Ovid, too, would have impacts at the historic level. His books, too, are still read, and his contributions, too, carried on the Greek and the Roman tradition in a way that is still recognizable today. And he, too, told the story in his own way. Scholars would write that he very consciously not only adapted the ancient stories for his own use, he would take Virgil's stories and freely change them to make his own stories work better. And 20 centuries later, a folk musician named Aeneid Mitchell would take this great story, powerfully carried forward by these two great works, and do what Virgil and Ovid had done before. Tell their own story in their own way and make the story ring true for their audiences. What changes did Mitchell make, and why did she make them? Did she ever ask, who am I to think that I can hold my head up higher than my fellow humans? Could this modern bard write something that would improve on Virgil and Ovid? She sure did, and we'll find out how in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. This is my normal plea for help. I really enjoy putting this podcast together. I need to find a way to make ends meet so that it's not just a time suck and a money suck, and you can help not by sending me money, but just by sending the podcast out to the places where you've got a little bit of influence. If this podcast scratches a particular itch in your brain, if you like musicals and music theory and history and weird coincidences, ghost stories, then you and I are of a like mind and we can help each other out making this. If you could give it a like, make sure that you subscribe to it, put it on your social media, tell a couple friends, do what you can do to spread the word about it. I would be forever grateful. All right. This is episode 3 of 8, the 8 episodes that we'll be doing about HADESTOWN. And today we are going to give our take, or I'm going to give my take on what Aeneid Mitchell's version of the Orpheus story is. The last 2 episodes have reviewed Roman history and then the history of the Orpheus story. And there was a lot there. They were each a couple hours long, and knowing what's going on in those will be important, understanding what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to do one more summary just so we can keep it all straight in our minds. I mean, it was like all the ancient stories, and then the 2 great books, one by Virgil, one by Ovid, and then the differences between them and different interpretations of the different meanings behind the different texts. So there's a lot that I think we can kind of boil down, and that'll set us up to understand what Mitchell did to make her story work in HADESTOWN. So as a quick timeline reminder, the story is set in the era of the Trojan War. That is when the action takes place. That's about 1300 BCE. Homer then wrote the first account of it at about 750 BC, so like 550, 600 years after it was supposed to have happened. Then Alexander the Great comes along, and he has his hand in unifying Greece a couple hundred years after that, so that's 333 BC. And then the big change happens in BCE 146 when Rome conquers Greece. That's about century and a half before the birth of Christ. Julius Caesar had his big run in about 50 BCE, and he is eventually succeeded by Augustus, who rules from 27 in the BCE to 14 years after the birth of Jesus. And Augustus was into order and morality, and Alexander was more into free expression, and he definitely wanted to have a Roman Empire, but wasn't so much into regulating the morality of individual people. Okay, so that's the big history of Rome. There are then 4 poets who take on the Orpheus story. That is, they want to write the story of Orpheus. The first guy is Homer. He takes it on, but just briefly. It's more like he mentions it, or it's kind of a passing reference that he makes. Then Euripides writes a story, and he's got the Roman rom-com. It's got a happy ending. That is, there's not a tragic moment where Orpheus turns back, looks back at Eurydice, and they both get dragged back into hell. There's a happy ending to Euripides' version, but Eurydice's version, but that's not really the one that anybody remembers. So those are the two stories that are out there. It's the only version where the lovers are happily reunited before death, and that's not the one that comes down through the ages. That leaves two more people who are telling this story. One was Virgil, and one was Ovid. Now, Virgil never married. He had a rural agricultural background. He is especially into beekeeping. He was born first, before Ovid was, and he was already considered Rome's greatest poet. His other stuff included the Aeneid, as we mentioned in the introduction, and that is the book about Rome. Whatever you think you know about Rome and the Roman Empire, or the ancient stories or the myths, that probably comes from Virgil, and it probably comes from the Aeneid. Now, he had some issues with the emperor, but the emperor liked him a bunch and did like his poetry. And there's one tale that's probably a myth that Virgil wanted to burn the Aeneid for some reason. Evidently, he wasn't happy with how it was coming together, but the emperor forced him to finish it and forced him to get it published. And he died of a fever with the poem still unfinished. It got finished up by the executors of his literary executors, whatever that job equivalent was in ancient Rome. And that is how the world inherited the Aeneid from Virgil. His version of Orpheus was in a separate book that was called the Georgics. All right. Ovid, on the other hand, was married 3 times, and he wrote about love a lot. He came second, that is, he came after Virgil, although he was alive in Virgil's lifetime. When Virgil passed, he was sort of in his late teens. He was, however, intentionally tried to become the, quote, next Virgil. That was, he wanted to become a poet that was as prominent as Virgil, but one that had his own unique style and his own unique voice. He's sort of like the Rolling Stones that followed the Beatles. The Beatles definitely came first, and they definitely set the genre, but the Stones definitely had their own run, and that's kind of what Ovid was in relationship to Virgil. Now, he was even more on the outs with the emperor than Virgil was. He was exiled by the emperor, maybe not for his poetry, but he was definitely on the blacklist. The emperor then tried to ban his works from public libraries. Censorship, however, never works, and this one really didn't work. Ovid is remembered centuries later. Whatever the emperor was trying to do to make it so that nobody ever heard from Ovid ever again did not work, and Ovid is one of the great poets that almost any college graduate can name. And both of these guys had influence that was way beyond measure. They basically never went out of print. Like, they wrote their poem, they turned it loose in ancient Rome, and anywhere that studies Latin still studies both of these guys. And everyone who has ever studied Latin for the last 20 centuries has always studied these two guys. They are just absolute giants in the world of literature and in storytelling and in what we know about ancient Greece. But their stories were different, and the big frame for the difference is that Virgil is more of a classical Greek tale where the gods mess with you, and the role of the humans is just to see how their fate plays out. The gods, they roll the dice and they make the decision for us. ABBA has told us that story, and by God, they understand where Virgil is coming from. But for Ovid, love and art also play a central role in the cosmic order. And his character, the version of Orpheus that he writes, is both the first rock star, the very first musician who's got power over the masses, and also maybe the first lover, the first person who is willing to say, or there are scholars who say, that Ovid created Orpheus. Orpheus was the first lover. Everybody loves a lover, and he's the first one. Now, it still might end in a tragedy, but so does, Romeo and Juliet, or other great movies like Casablanca, or even the Titanic. So it could be a tragic story, but still a good love story. And Ovid is one of the very first to create a genre where the Greek tragedies and the great Greek stories and epics are also a great love story. Okay. So they have different takes on it, and there's a big frame that makes it different, but there are some parts of the story that don't change. No matter who's telling it, there's some things that always happen. The core parts of the story go this way. The myth starts with the story of Hades and Persephone. And Hades abducts Persephone, probably rapes her. Persephone's mom, Demeter, gets really mad about that and has Zeus intercede. And then Persephone ends up spending 6 months in hell with Hades and then 6 months up on Earth. And this is the origin story and the mystical explanation for the way that the seasons work. If you were to say, to an ancient Roman, hey, why is it the sun goes across the sky? You would say, oh, well, that's the god taking his chariot and driving it across every single day. And if you were to say, okay, so that makes sense to me, but why is it that the seasons change? They would say, oh, well, because Persephone has to spend 6 months in hell with Hades and then gets to spend 6 months up on the planet with the rest of us, and that's why the seasons change. Okay, anyway, it's a story to explain for the Greeks and the Romans why the seasons pass. And that's the backstory. Then the actual Orpheus story starts. Eurydice dies by a snake bite. Orpheus has divine musical power. He sings a song that warms Hades hard enough that he's able to strike a deal with Hades, where Hades says, I will let Eurydice go out of hell with you. I've been persuaded by your song enough that I'm going to give you a shot. If you can walk all the way from where we are now to out of hell without looking back, then you and Eurydice could both go back to the mortal world and live on the face of the earth. Orpheus almost gets there. And then he looks back at the very last second. Eurydice goes back to hell, and Orpheus wanders around playing sad music before he too eventually dies. Those are the counterparts to every version of the Orpheus story. But those are not the only things that go on in the Orpheus story, and there are definitely variations. Li Yanfen of the National Shanghai University, which is located in Taipei City, Taiwan, recapped some of the main differences in the story. We went over those very extensively in the last episode, but we'll summarize a couple here. In Virgil, Eurydice is pursued by Aristeus. Aristeus is an agrarian beekeeper. He can't find his bees, and he starts chasing Eurydice around. She steps on a snake and dies. Now, some people think this adds a nature and poetry element to the story. If Eurydice is being pursued by two men, one is Orpheus. He represents poetry and love and abstract art. And she's also pursued by Aristeus, who represents agriculture and the earth and practicality. Then, if you understand the story that way, and that's the way the Virgil wrote it, then there's some environmental issues. So Virgil's actually writing about the environmental issues of his time, which is basically the hardship for the rural farms in Rome. Ovid is not. Ovid makes no mention of Aristeus. He is just writing about love. So that's one important difference between Virgil and Ovid. Then there's the descent into hell. Now, this is definitely in Virgil, and Virgil spends a lot of time describing it, and Ovid really doesn't talk about it very much. And then there's also the story back. Orpheus, after has his confrontation, has to turn back. And there's a deep description of that in Ovid, but there's almost none in Virgil. So Virgil's emphasizing the descent, and Ovid emphasizes the return. There's also a difference in how good the song that Orpheus sings to Hades is. For Virgil, there's just another character that references that it happened. Doesn't say what it is, and it's definitely not coming out of the mouth of Orpheus. But Ovid includes the speech and lots of detail about it, and how it was so awesome that all of hell stopped. The fates were moved to tears. Sisyphus got stopped moving his rock up. There were other things and more details, but for Ovid, there's a deep description of that song, and for Virgil, he just kind of brushes it over. Then there's the question of, so why does Orpheus turn back? He's almost there. He almost turns around, and then he doesn't. In Virgil, this is because of something called either dementia or furor, but it's definitely tragic, and Eurydice is really mad at him, or at least she's very betrayed, or at least she's like, man, we almost got out of hell, and then you blew it at the last second. But for Virgil, this is just sort of a human condition, human frailty. Humans make big mistakes, and because Orpheus is human, he made his big mistake. So there you have it. It's part of the great unforgiving nature of the Roman world. In Ovid, however, he turns back because of love and anxiety, and it's very forgivable. In fact, the exact wording is not Eurydice forgave him, but it's that Eurydice couldn't be mad because he turned around because he loved her. So she was loved. You can't get mad at anybody for loving you. And if that's their failing, then I guess that's something that happens. Okay, now in Virgil, then they descend back up. That's skipped over in Virgil, but Ovid spends a lot of time talking about it. Now they get back to the surface. So Orpheus is back on the surface. Eurydice is still in hell. Orpheus then wanders for 7 years in Virgil, where he is finally killed by a group of very angry women. But his head, because they decapitate him, his head keeps singing, and it ends up on the Isle of Lesbos. In Ovid, so that's Virgil's version. In Ovid, he fasts not for 7 years. He doesn't mourn for 7 years. He doesn't wander for 7 years. He fasts for 7 days. which is what a human would do. He then turns to pederasty. It would be a betrayal of Eurydice for him to fall in love with another woman. So instead, he expresses his sexual desires with other boys. We've talked about the morality of that, or what we are to make of that in episode 2. It definitely grosses us out today. And I will say there's no contemporary description of what the young boys that he was having sex with thought about it. But the commentators all seem to agree that at least for Ovid, this was to either humanize Orpheus or to make it funny or to make it a little bit softer. But anyway, in Ovid talks about the pederasty. Virgil does not. And then there is a very long description of the death in Ovid, of the death of Orpheus in Ovid. Virgil writes about it for 3 lines about how Orpheus got killed, but Ovid spans 43 lines and makes it even more brutal. In Ovid's story, the music that Orpheus is playing can ward off the blows, and it does more to highlight the difference between the musical charm that Orpheus possesses and the women's violence that is in Ovid. That's important to Ovid's telling the story in Virgil. It's not that big a deal. And then finally, Ovid has Orpheus reunited with Eurydice in the underworld. Here, there are some very specific linguistic parallels that Ovid is using that Li Yen Fen thinks makes it really funny. If you're deep into Virgil, I won't trust Li Yen Fen, but if you're reading the original Latin, Li Yen Fen says what Ovid's doing is actually wordplay on what Virgil had written. And in the end, they're finally reunited back in hell, and they get to walk side by side. And Orpheus actually follows the lead of Eurydice, and then they can safely look at each other once again. Now, at the end of these stories, nobody lifts a cup to Orpheus. Not Persephone, not Hermes, not Eurydice, and certainly not Hades. The story ends just either when Orpheus is killed, or as Virgil's story ends, or when he returns back to hell as Ovid's story ends. But there's no celebration of Orpheus. Okay, well, how do you summarize all that? Well, for Li Yen Fen, Ovid is one big parody of Virgil. Ovid is trying to come up with a unique voice, make a name for himself as a poet, tell a funny story, and it's all parody. But for Charles Siegel, he is a poet in revolt. He subtly but powerfully is asserting a new voice that challenges common Roman culture. It might even be a celebration of slacker culture. Like it might be that Ovid is standing up and saying, hey, it's okay to just enjoy the sensual things in life, things like music and love and probably sex. Those are all things that are okay to enjoy. And that is the point of what Ovid is doing, not just try to be funny. Here's the quote from Charles Siegel, quote, Ovid's tale is exactly the opposite of Virgil's. He presents the triumph of imagination, emotionality, and interior life over external reality, end quote. And one more quote from Siegel. This is actually not from Siegel. This is a quote from Brooks Otis that Siegel includes in his book. And it says, quote, Ovid is the West's first champion of true, normal, and even conjugal love, end quote. So Ovid is all in on art has political power. Okay, now I mentioned this before, but there are maybe 2 different reasons that Augustus decided to exile Ovid and ban his work. One is that he was involved in a court scandal with Augustus's granddaughter. There was, in fact, a scandal. There were people who did get exiled. But that doesn't explain why you would ban Ovid's books. At least the versions I've read is like Ovid might have been implicated, but it wasn't like he was having sex with the granddaughter or that he was a central, like, he and the granddaughter were the lovers in question. It's more like there's a big scandal and he might have had something to do with it. Now, it's a pretty long way around the block to say, okay, I'm Augustus and I'm so mad at you, I'm going to not only exile you out of Rome, but I'm also going to censor and ban all of your books. You would ban the books if you thought they had political potential. So that sort of gives some oomph to the Charles Siegel's interpretation that actually Ovid is all about art has a political dimension to it. Ovid was a poet in revolt, trying to challenge Augustus, and Augustus knew that, which explains why he exiled him and why he banned the books. Okay. Anyway, for Virgil, there are gods and a cold universe. And if you're an ancient Greek or an ancient Roman and you're founding civilization for the first time, you notice there's a lot going on in nature and it's probably trying to kill you. And there are gods out there, but they're not necessarily friendly. And the question is, how do humans exist in this cold and indifferent universe? But for Ovid, love and art are an important part of the mix, and they are in fact things that can change the world. Okay, so how does all this relate to Mitchell? We've got Ovid and Virgil telling their own versions of the stories. Well, here's what I think. There are 3 great poets who have told the Orpheus story, at least. There is Virgil, there is Ovid, and there is Aeneas Mitchell. She has the definitive retelling for the 21st century. And I always get the century numbers messed up. That means after the year 2000, Aeneas Mitchell is the person that is the great poet that is retelling the story in our generation. And just like Virgil and Ovid before her, she's doing her own version of it. Now, there have been tons of adaptations of this over time, so I'm just focusing on the one that is most contemporary for us. But I do think it is fair to ask, Virgil was retelling the story in his own voice, and Ovid was retelling the story in his own voice. So Mitchell is retelling the story in her own voice. How did she do it, and what was she doing? Not everyone that takes up the story does it for their own place and time. And there's not really a tradition of retelling the story that where you have to stay true to the original. It's more about using the framework of that story to advance your world. So Virgil did not follow what Homer or Euripides had done. He articulated it as part of the master vision of the world, the gods, and the nation of Rome. And for Ovid, he was revolting against the vision and was insisting that love and art plays a key role in the universe. Mitchell then needs to ask the question, how does the story speak to the world in the 21st century? What is my version of the story? What vision of reality and the cosmos am I trying to advance? Well, the human relationships are certainly different when Mitchell's writing HADESTOWN. The environmental issues are certainly different. It's not about bees and agriculture anymore. And there are some new points that need to be emphasized. Okay, so Mitchell walks into the story. Mitchell has a muse. There's something that calls Mitchell to write about the Orpheus story. Why did Mitchell decide she was going to take up the Orpheus story? Well, she said in an interview that I've got the footnote to in the notes, and here is the quote. Quote, I was just at the beginning of a career as a singer-songwriter, and I was driving from one tip gig to another when the melody of Wait For Me dropped out of the sky. It came with some long-lost lyrics that seemed to describe the Orpheus and Euripides myth, which had been a favorite of mine as a kid. I started to follow the thread into the labyrinths, and I think what inspired me most about retelling the story was the idea of pitting young, creative, optimistic Orpheus against the underworld where the rules are the rules. Over many years of development, I've identified with many different characters, but at first, it was the idea of Orpheus, who believes if he could just write something beautiful enough, he could move the heart of stone, he could change the way the world is. That was inspiring to me, end quote. All right, that is well put. I'm not going to improve on Mitchell's own recounting of why she picked it, but I got to say, Mitchell is a folk songwriter. She is drawn, it just seems to me, she is drawn to the story of art changing the world. If you're a musician, if you're a songwriter, if you're an artist, you believe that what you're doing has some value. And if that's what you do, and especially if you're a songwriter, and especially if you know anything about ancient Greece, Orpheus is your guy. What we know is that what Mitchell's talking about is the Charles Siegel version of Ovid. This story matters because it shows the power of music, even in the midst of tragedy. In this way, she is all team Ovid. Art and love can change the world. We'll see that Orpheus is a compelling character who is spoken of and written about and adapted a lot. This is not really a Hades or a Persephone story. It's not really a Eurydice story. It's an Orpheus story. He's, remember, the first rock star and the first lover. So I now think we have the answer. Why is it that Mitchell decided to tell the Orpheus story in the first place? Well, you're a songwriter and you want to write music that can change the world. Who's your role model? Well, it is Orpheus, the very first rock star, the guy with the gift of the gods that can literally make the rocks cry. For the rest of this episode, we're just going to trace the remainder of Mitchell's choices. But first, a little bit of background and context notes. Mitchell actually wrote a book in 2020 called Working on a Song, The Lyrics of HADESTOWN. Now, in Phantom of the Opera and in Cats, there are indeed official books about those productions, and they're like 8 pages of text. Everybody writes a couple of their story, the director gets a couple of pages, the musicians get a couple of pages, the set designer gets a couple of pages. But Working on a Song, the book that Mitchell wrote, is about like 220 pages long, plus or minus the filler, like the pages at the beginning and the end. And a lot of it is just putting in the lyrics of the song. But man, I got to tell you, when you work your way through this book, it is hard not to come away liking Aeneas Mitchell. She cries at her own lyrics. That is awesome. you're feeling it enough that you can read what you yourself has just written and tears come to your eyes. There's multiple references to that. She also drinks a lot. And I don't mean like in a problematic way, like let's all together and, have a society do a big group intervention for Aeneas Mitchell. I mean that she seems like she's a lot of fun to hang out at a pub with. And in fact, a whole bunch of the decisions. And when I say, okay, the book's 220 pages long, but only about 100 of that is her actually talking about stuff. The rest of it is the recounting of the lyrics and how the lyrics have changed over time. But of that remaining material, a surprising amount is devoted to Aeneas Mitchell saying, so this issue had come up and I hadn't really eaten very much, but I'd had a bunch of wine and that probably affected the conversation that I had. And she talks about that like 5 or 6 times. Anyway, I really like Aeneas Mitchell. It just sounds like she's a lot of fun to be around. And it sounds like she is fully invested, of course, in her work and the project of taking the story about Orpheus and seeing if she too can write songs that will move the world. Her accounting, which you can get in her book, but several other places, goes like this. It started, HADESTOWN did, as a community theater project in Vermont in 2006. And then she found a record company that released an album of the songs, Jesus Christ Superstar style, in 2010. If you remember our episodes about Jesus Christ Superstar, that album came out before the musical did. In fact, the idea behind Jesus Christ Superstar was, could you launch an entire Broadway musical on the strength of a pop music album? The answer there was yes. And it is interesting to me that Mitchell's doing the same thing. She's got an album of her songs that go into HADESTOWN that comes out in 2010. In 2012, she meets Rachel Chavkin, who will be the director that ushers the show forward. And then in 2016, the show appears at the New York Theater Workshop, which is an off-Broadway venue. Now, just notice that's 2016, and it started in 2006, and that's 10 years to go from community theater to off-Broadway. But now we're in 2016. In 2017, 1 year later, it moves to the Citadel Theater in Edmonton, Canada. In 2018, 1 year after that, it moves to the London National Theatre. And in 2019, 1 year after that, it opens on Broadway. So it goes 10 years of development between community theater and off-Broadway. And then it goes 3 years from off-Broadway to Canada to London to Broadway in just record breakneck speed. And then in 2019, it got 14 Tony nominations, won 8. And the theme of the book is that the whole story was constantly developing, it was constantly changing. They were making changes to the staging and the characters and the music and the everything. And then it sort of hit its stride, and then it took over Broadway once it got there. Okay. There are 2 main things that I think Mitchell did in adapting her story, and then we'll talk about the specific choices. But the big picture, the framing, she made the story relevant to contemporary life. Obviously, the story is talking about climate change. There's an excerpt in the book about how she was once serving drinks. She worked before she became a big deal. She was working as a waitress, serving drinks. There were some climate deniers that she ended up serving that had an effect on there. That gets addressed a lot by people who comment on the motivation that Mitchell had behind this. Like if you go to the secondary sources and all the magazine stories and the press coverage, they pick up on that a lot. But even without that, they're probably making more out of that one encounter than it truly had in the effect on Aeneas Mitchell. But the theme is clearly there. Like if you watch that show, you are definitely going to know they're talking about environment and they're talking about climate change. The show is also obviously about marginalization. The wall will become a big deal, especially during the Trump presidency. But at the time it was written, it was written in 2006, and the chants of build the wall, those were a decade off. When Mitchell was writing the original play, she was just talking about, hey, there are people who are marginalized, the poor people that we try to keep out with the wall. And then that came in almost a literal thing with Donald Trump as the president. The show is also obviously about gender relations. The Me Too movement, especially the relationship between Hades and Eurydice. In early versions, it is just a sexual exchange. Like Eurydice is like, hey man, I'm leaving my guy Orpheus, this youngster who's a great musician, but is not putting food on the table. And I'm going to hang out with an older man who can keep me fed and give me some shelter. Now, all those specific applications are all almost accidental. The Me Too movement came after the book was written. The wall came after it, and a whole bunch of stuff that's happened with climate change came after the show was originally conceived in 2006. But my take is a great show with timeless themes is going to have that happen. If you're at a really great story about marginalization and privilege, well, stuff's going to happen in the world that involves marginalization and privilege, and that's going to be directly relevant to what you're talking about. If you write about imbalanced and exploitative sexual relationships, and you write it really well, there are going to be some exploitative sexual relationships that come out there. Epstein. And if you've done a good job of that, then your story is going to resonate when those things happen. So I think Aeneas Mitchell took the ancient story, made it relevant to contemporary life, did so in a really powerful way. And then the fact that reality was imitating her art is just a testament to how well she did it. So she made it relevant to contemporary life, but she also updated the relationships they have in that. Abductions and forced marriages, well, those aren't really 21st century things that happen anymore, but they're in all the Greek stories. Now, of course, we don't have abductions. We have the Epstein files. We frown upon people who abduct and force young women into sexual relationships with them. That's a big problem in a way it just wasn't in ancient Greece. And so Mitchell's not really talking about the abduction, right? It's not like about how did the season start? Well, doggone it, Demeter got mad at Zeus, or got mad because her daughter Persephone had been hijacked by Hades and kind of forced into a shotgun marriage. And then Zeus intervened, and that's how the seasons happen. Now, those are not the relationships that we talk about. We now have relationships that grow, that mature over time. Relationships have trials. Like, there are very few people who can say, I've been married 30 years and we've never had an argument or we've never had an issue. And I think there's a general recognition that there's kind of the early part of relationships, which is super fun and exciting and sensual and sexual. And that over time, that might stay or it might change, but there will definitely be other things that you have to work through. That's what Mitchell's going to write about when she writes about Persephone and Hades, and that's how she's going to explore the relationship going on between Eurydice and Orpheus. And Orpheus is going to be the key to all that. Mitchell's got to figure out who is Orpheus, what's his relationship to Eurydice, put that at the center of the action of the rest of the characters, and that should give some layered insight into human and human relationships. So as a summary, Mitchell's telling is going to take on the Ovid theme of art changing the world. She's going to develop relationships in a way that resonates with the modern audience, and she's going to address some contemporary political issues. On this episode today, we're just going to compare and contrast Mitchell's great tale with that of Virgil and Ovid, and then we're going to go to depth on some of the individual themes in future episodes. In Working on a Song, remember that's the memoir that Mitchell wrote about her development of the show. There's no real evidence of how much Mitchell is directly aware of the Virgil versus Ovid differences. She's clearly aware of the original story. She's talking more about how she made the story work for her and modern audiences, and actually just kind of the writer's struggle is what she's talking about. So what we're doing here isn't so much I'm telling you this is the process Mitchell went through. I'm saying this is for our edification to allow us to compare and contrast where that journey took her and where it did not take Virgil and Ovid. So I'm not going to try to give out too many spoilers, but I'm also not going to retell the entire HADESTOWN story. I'm just going to focus on the key elements of choice that Mitchell made and how Mitchell chose to tell the story. And then I'm going to try to relate that to the way Virgil and Ovid told their story. Okay. So the choices, let's first of all talk about what she did not do. What do you do with all that backstory? Well, Mitchell decided I am going to jettison it. The thing about Persephone getting abducted, gone. The thing about Aristeas from Virgil, that is also gone. Now, let's just make sure we get all of our footnotes right here. There are authors named Alvarez and Saltzman Mitchell of Montclair State. We talked about them in the last episode, but they noticed that that thing about Aristeas might have something to do about the balance of the earth. So leaving it out might miss some important things about human and nature. And so Alvarez and Saltzman Mitchell are not entirely cool with the choice of leaving Aristeas out. I like the choice. The bees are actually quite interesting, and bees are linked to climate change, like colony collapse. Bee colony collapse is a real thing. And of course, you need bees to pollinate stuff or nothing grows. But it's not really the core 21st century issue. It is true that there's colony collapse and we're worried about that, but it's probably the result of pesticides or climate change, heat patterns and whatnot. Ovid did not have fossil fuels that were getting burned, but Mitchell lives in an age where that's what we really all have to deal with. So her choice is to go big on industrialization and the problem, and that's directly linking it to hell. And although she does take out that potential connection with Aristeas, I don't think you could say her show doesn't say enough about the environment, or it should have been included a bit about Aristeas in the news. Now, also in some tellings of the Orpheus story, the god of marriage refuses to condone the wedding of Eurydice and Orpheus. That is also not in Mitchell's tale. The thing about Orpheus going as an Argonaut, yes, Orpheus was one of the Argonauts traveled with Jason. That's fascinating, but it's also not in the story. And instead of any of that, the show just kind of starts with the idea that the seasons change as Persephone moves between Hades and Earth. Nature is out of whack because Persephone is out of whack. And that's because her relationship with Hades is a modern tale of codependence and emotional unavailability. And that is where she's going to land. So all that precursor stuff is not in Mitchell's story. So that's what she did with all the stuff that comes before Orpheus meets Eurydice. What do you do about all the stuff after the Orpheus looks back? Eurydice goes to hell and Orpheus wanders the earth. That part where he gets ripped apart by a bunch of angry women, that's gone. The bit about pederasty and having sex with boys, that's gone. The part about how he might later be reunited in hell with Eurydice, that is also gone. The part about how he wanders the world singing sad songs, he gets decapitated, his head continues to sing, his head becomes an oracle, an entire religion is based on Orpheus. All that is gone. The story just ends where she looks back. And I do think both of those choices were necessary to give the show some focus. In Mitchell's book, she does talk about one of the problems they have is the pacing of the show, that it went on in some early iterations. It was going on too long, especially the second act. And she needed to get it focused on something. And so including all that other stuff, although some of it is truly fascinating, did need to go for Mitchell to get to her point. Okay. Those are the things she cut out. What decisions did she make? Well, I got 6 of them I'm going to cover, and then we'll summarize it and wrap it up. Major decision number 1, Eurydice's death. Roy Scheider in Jaws made it pretty clear that it was a shark attack and not a boating accident. Mitchell makes it pretty clear that Eurydice's entry into Hades is a grief-stricken poverty choice. It is not a snake bite. In all the other stories, the other tellings of the story, Eurydice is just bitten by a snake, and so she's got to go to hell. But for Mitchell, it is a choice that Eurydice makes, and that is kind of important. In Mitchell's version, in HADESTOWN, Eurydice makes a deal with Hades, and in some incantations of the story, it's sexual, right? That it's a younger woman getting rid of her juvenile boyfriend who can't put food on the table and can't make a living to go with a materially successful older man. We've seen that play out more than a couple times in modern society, and that is the relationship that Mitchell is pursuing. Now, in the Broadway version, it's not explicitly sexual. That's implied, or at least it's possible. But either way, she's working in a New Orleans-style bar. She can barely make ends meet. She falls in love with the singer Orpheus, but he can't put a dime in his pocket or get food on the table or pay the rent, and he even seems like oblivious to it. So she makes a deal with Hades. And she says, all right, Hades, I will join you in hell in exchange for some basic shelter and a minimum calorie diet. And then it doesn't quite work out for her the way she thinks, which is part of the plot, but that is the fundamental choice and the reason that Eurydice ends up in Hades. Now, telling the story this way does 3 things. First of all, it identifies a common female condition. Poverty is a problem, and it's a problem that sucks for women more than it sucks for men. Women end up needing to trade their sensuality and their sexuality more just for basic survival than men end up having to do. And there's just all kinds of research from the UNESCO, from the United Nations, from people who study poverty, from people who study women's issues that clearly document that poverty is a problem, but it is an intersectional problem, so that poverty is different, is experienced differently by women than it is by men. And at least in our society, the inherited model is that men are the breadwinners and females only get access to the things they need to survive by marrying a male who will provide them the material things. That is now more complicated in the 21st century than it was in, say, the 19th century. But by telling the story the way that Mitchell tells it, then that becomes front and central to the plot. That becomes something that the audience thinks about, something that you grapple with as you experience the show. It also shows, the second thing it does is it shows an impossible choice, that you have love, beauty, and art. That is one option. Or you can do that soul-crushing day job in advertising that you need to pay the bills. That's something that many people face. And it just does a good job of dramatizing that, so that central question is on the table, that you understand this is a story about material survival versus the power of art, or at least about the material problems that we all face and its relationship to beauty and art. The same thing that Ovid wanted to talk about. And finally, it makes the relationship with Orpheus much more contemporary and relevant. It's kind of like Roger and Mimi in the musical Rent. Remember, he's the songwriter with the guitar, and she's working in a bar to pay the bills, and they try to find love through his music and love with each other. Mimi and Eurydice were both working as waitresses in a cocktail bar. That much is true. A relationship that spans Rent, HADESTOWN, and the Human League is broad enough to be a trope of modern society that should resonate with all of us. But this choice to write the story this way makes it a recognizable relationship with recognizable difficulties that will ring true to a modern audience. So, like I said, one of the big themes about what is Mitchell doing as she tells the Orpheus story is she's updating the relationships and making it something that a modern audience needs to deal with. Major decision number 2, Hades and Persephone. There's stuff in the Greek myth. Certainly Hades and Persephone are people, and Hades has got more written about him than Persephone does, but they're kind of flat in the Orpheus tale, and Mitchell really fleshes them out. Hades is an industrialist. He's a power guy. And his problem, one of his failings, is that he buys his own public relations schlock. He's in charge of Hades, and Hades is now a mining town. Let's remember that, put a pin in it. Hell is portrayed as a mining town. That's going to become important as other people experience the story. And he's sold the workers on the idea that they need to keep a wall to keep the other really poor people out, that the threat to the workers is not the massive income inequality between the people who own the factory and the people working the factory. It's between the people who are the minimum wage workers of the factory and the other people who can't even get that work. The real danger is the outsiders who are even more poor than the people working inside. That is definitely something that Hades is selling to the workers. And what he's offering them is a minimal subsistence in exchange for really hard manual labor. And one of the horrors that the people in Hades have to suffer is memory loss. Now, Mitchell alludes to this in her book, Working on a Song. And there's a curious connection between the play Eurydice. So Hadestown is the Orpheus story where Eurydice is a central character. But separate from all that, there's an entirely separate play that is not a musical written by Sarah Rule that is called Eurydice. And in that version of the play, memory loss is the central theme, that there's a metaphor between the memory loss that is experienced by the people in Hades, as told in the ancient Orpheus story, and the memory loss that members of Sarah Rule's family are experiencing. And that's kind of the whole thing. But for both Rule and for Mitchell, memory loss is an important part of being in hell. That when you get to hell, the only person who's allowed to remember anything is Hades himself, and the workers lose their memory. And that's going to become important to many people to try to figure out the political themes of this show. And finally, Hades proclaims that he's doing all of it for Persephone, that the world is basically a Hobbesian, Darwinian, dog-eat-dog bloodbath. Think about The Walking Dead. And he needs to win it to keep himself and his family safe. And that's where he buys his own PR. He's the guy who sees the world as if it is. There's no love. There's no joy. There's just providing for your family. They're winners and they're losers. And he wants to be a winner. Anyway, that is how Mitchell rounds out the character of Hades. We understand him much, much better than we do in the classic Orpheus myth. Persephone is a woman in a golden cage relationship. She is like a real Mormon housewife of Orange County or Florida or Hades or wherever, and she's turning to booze to dull the pain. Okay, so here's just a little glimpse into my childhood. I have alluded in the past. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah. It was heavily Mormon, and what I noticed repeatedly was I had friends, of course, growing up. Most of my friends were Mormon because most everybody was Mormon. And the women clearly knew that they were expected to get married and have a bunch of kids and work. It was not clear if they were even supposed to do that. Was that good or bad? But they all had smiles on their face. And all my female friends, you could just feel the weight that expectation had on them. Like, you were probably going to marry a guy. It was probably going to work out. You'd probably have a nice house, but you were going to be so constricted in the role of mother and caregiver and provider for your spouse that was all you had. And if that wasn't what you wanted, that took a toll on you. when I grew up, Prozac was just coming into the world into the 1980s. And where I lived in Salt Lake City, there was a suburb called Sandy, and Prozac was called Sandy Candy because so many of the Mormon housewives were experiencing depression that they would turn to Prozac to try to help them deal with the meaninglessness that their life had taken on. I remember in grad school in Salt Lake City, there was a female fellow student. She was really bright, but she was being exposed to some deep feminist theory for the first time. And what she decided she was going to do is an analysis of the writings of the Mormon Church. They had this conference, and the prophet of the Mormon Church publishes these proceedings. And he had this whole section that talked about how awesome Mormon women were and that they were the foundation of the family and that we should venerate and elevate all the Mormon women. And she read through it and she was like, they're saying nice stuff about me, but boy, it pushes me into such a hole and I feel awful about it. And anyway, it was just a powerful and weird moment to watch this very smart Mormon female put together her experience, some new ideas she hadn't been exposed to, and what her church was telling her about her own role. Anyway, the golden cage relationship is definitely something that's current. It's definitely something that's contemporary. And that is the role that Anais Mitchell puts Persephone in. It is Persephone who will be threatened by Hades and his relationship with the younger woman Eurydice. And it is she who will eventually sympathize with the younger couple. Persephone has got stuff going on, but her central conflict is she's in a relationship that gives her material benefit, but it is coming at the expense of her happiness, a golden cage relationship. And that's a much more rounded out version of who Persephone is and what her motivations are than you're going to find in Ovid or in Virgil. And then the problems with nature play out like this. Nature is out of whack because industrialization has thrown the balance between humans and nature out of whack. There's industrialization that's taking a toll on the planet, and we're taking too much stuff from planet Earth without enough attention to the needs of the planet. That industrialization is not hard to tell, Mitchell is saying, is an expression of this very toxic and very male attempt at domination and control. Control over the world, control over women, control over everything. That Hades is the personification of industrialization. He's very male, he's very controlling, and he's very unable to see the world in any way that is not. There's winners and losers, and by God, I'm going to win. And part of the problem between industrialization and nature is that relationships are out of whack. Marriage pairings are about protection and gratification, and very traditional male provider, women as reproducer or sex partner or emotional support therapist. But men are in charge of getting the capital, and women are in charge of doing all the relationship work. That is the vision of relationships that is in Hadestown. That's the conflict between both Eurydice and Orpheus and Persephone and Hades. And in 21st century parlance, this is dysfunctional. There are dysfunctional relationships, and those dysfunctional relationships have effects on the dysfunctional relationships between humans, and people in romantic relationships create dysfunctional relationships between humanity in general and with planet Earth. As the middle schoolers might say, they got issues. The Persephone's got issues with Hades, and Eurydice's got issues with Orpheus. And then once Eurydice goes to Hades, now she's got issues with Hades. And there is also probably some issues between Persephone and Eurydice as a result of that. Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is this choice to emphasize relationships and make them rich creates a really complex literary setup. This telling of the story allows Mitchell to explore Hades and his dysfunctions, and Persephone and her dysfunctions, and link those dysfunctions to the way society is dysfunctional in general. And finally, it sets up one big contrast with a younger couple, which drives the action. And if you listen really closely to those prior episodes, you might have noticed that this sounds an awful lot like the psychoanalytic criticism that we have talked about over the course of prior episodes. Psychoanalytic criticism is something that people are doing at universities an awful lot. They're trying to understand the world and the human experience through literature. If you're into the humanities, one of the things you've been exposed to is psychoanalytic criticism. But oh my God, is that a $10 academic word? What does that mean? Well, it kind of comes down to this. You can't explain all human behavior in rational terms because we do stupid and self-destructive things all the time. To understand why humans do that, you can't explain it with rationality. So you do psychoanalysis. You analyze the human psyche to understand why we do stupid and self-destructive things with the idea that you can help humans understand their problems and make better choices. When humans get together to form societies, they also behave in ways that can't be explained rationally, and they still do stupid things like we make bombs that could end the entire planet. That's a bad idea. So maybe many people think you would use these tools of psychoanalysis to understand the bad choices people make at individual levels to see if there's a way we can understand why societies make bad choices. And in HADESTOWN, when Mitchell writes HADESTOWN, this is all on display as the societal dysfunction that causes environmental damage is very obviously linked to dysfunctional relationships. And this is done in a way more digestible and fun way than reading Michel Foucault. What I think Mitchell has accomplished is making a very open, accessible presentation of the ideas of psychoanalytic criticism in a way that makes a whole lot of people understand it. That's a very 21st century thing to do. And it's something I think that Ovid and Virgil were not capable of doing. And I think it's something that Mitchell does very well. Major decision number 3, the power of art. Now, this is more of an updating of Ovid, because Ovid is definitely all in on art can change the world, but she is right there with him, man. If Ovid believes that art and music could change the world, so does Aeneid Mitchell. Working on a Song, her book about developing the show, has a long description of what Mitchell wanted to do. Good writing is getting a lot out of a little, especially in a musical with a very limited amount of time. That is, every word, every sentence has to convey a ton of meaning for your musical to work, because you only got about 2 hours to get a lot of ideas out there. Now, in that book, Working on a Song, Mitchell writes about how there were many versions of how to do that, how to across multiple shows, and it all kind of culminated in a breakdown. There's a parallel here to Dale Wasserman. He was the guy who wrote The Man of La Mancha. After it was a massive success, he describes that he had a total meltdown, mental breakdown, where he literally could not get out of bed. And I want you to let's listen to what Mitchell describes happened to her. Here we go. Quote, "As we approached the lock date for Broadway, I was staying with Mara in her friend's apartment uptown so I could focus on writing without commuting back and forth to Brooklyn. I was barely sleeping. I tried taking sleep aids, but my anxiety was stronger than the pills, and there I was, groggy, but still awake and still trying to work. At 2 a.m. one night, I knocked on Mara's bedroom door and climbed into bed with her like a child. And I said, I'm panicking." And her problem was that she was at that point trying to work on the song Epic 3. But let's just notice that, boy, there's a lot of pressure on Broadway. It seems like even if you're a success, you break down. And if you're trying to get there, you might break down too. But I guess all that shows Mitchell and Wasserman are so committed to their art. Why would you put yourself through that? You're putting yourself through that because you believe it is that important to get your art out into the world. And she got there. The solution to all of the dysfunction in the play is art and music. And Hermes gets the line. She got there from all these invitations. How am I going to communicate all of these ideas in a short, concise way? Hermes gets the line, quote, "This poor boy brought the world back in tune," is what he did. End quote. Nature's out of whack. Relationships are out of whack. It's all out of whack. And Orpheus is going to write a song that is so good, it will restore balance to everything. What can restore balance? Music, but only if it's good enough. And Orpheus has music that is good enough. He is going to teach the world to sing a song in perfect harmony. All right, sorry, that's my only 70s throwback. I got a little carried away when I was squeezing bread lyrics in the last couple episodes. But what Aeneid Mitchell has done there is she's clearly articulated that she believes the power of art and music changed the world. Episode number 4, couples dynamics. Okay, so the first character is Orpheus, and you got to get him right. We got to make sure that the audience relates to Orpheus correctly. Well, on page 95 of her book, she has a discussion of a line where Orpheus dismisses Eurydice in early versions of the show, and that seemed arrogant. A small but subtle change was where it wasn't that he blew her off. He just couldn't hear her because he was too into his music. And the net effect is that you can no longer blame Orpheus. He's just being who he is. For him, the genius, the musical genius, the music is always there. And that's what he's hearing, to the point where he can't quite connect with other human beings. You can't blame him for being himself, but you also can't blame Eurydice for leaving him, because there's nothing in that relationship for her. It's not that he's blowing her off or that he's unwilling to try to help. It's that he can't even hear her. On page 171, Mitchell talks about earlier versions of the show. presented him as being too arrogant. And that changed to where he is now naive. So much so that both Persephone and Eurydice want to protect him. He becomes sympathetic because he's so into his music and he's so naive and he is just so, I believe my music can change the world in the face of all reality. That makes the audience sympathetic with him, and it also makes the characters Persephone and Eurydice. And then on page 111, here's a direct quote, I began to truly suspect that no amount of poetic imagery of internal rhythm prowess were going to make us fall in love with Orpheus. It was the naive, heart-on-the-sleeve beauty and his singing alone that might move us, allowing Hermes to approach him unheard, again depicted him as a boy lost in his own world. End quote. So that is the vision that Mitchell has of Orpheus, and it changed for her over the different incantations of the play. And it's also not the classical version of Orpheus. R.A. Smith wrote in 1997 now. He is a professor of classics at Baylor University. He was the associate dean of their honors college for 16 years, and he had previously chaired the classics department, and he ran the Baylor in Italy program from 1992 to 2001. He had an awful lot of connection with Baylor in the classics department. What I find fun about this is my first job was at Baylor University, and I also worked there in the very year that he published this, 94 to 97. So he and I overlapped, and man, what a time to be at Baylor. The Branch Davidians had just finished their meltdown with the federal government. There were basketball players who were shooting each other. There were football players who were committing massive sexual assaults on a massive scale on the college campus, which eventually led to the firing of Kenneth Starr. Brittany Griner was changing the game of college basketball before later denouncing the school for homophobia. And I am mentioning all this because just this week, the athletic director at Baylor University had to step down, not for the sex scandals of the football players, not because he had confronted a player during a practice and yelled at him about the color of his jersey, although he also did that, and not for the basketball players shooting each other or murdering each other, or the homophobia that Brittany Griner experienced. Not for any of that. He has independently managed to sexually harass someone, and that got him fired at Baylor University. Anyway, that's what Baylor University is like. But none of that is bad stuff that R.A. Smith did. He's just the professor of the classics. And the point he makes is that Orpheus is vain. Now, this is not a problem with the Greek audiences who are okay with arrogant heroes. So we have quoted R.A. Smith just to demonstrate in the classic Greek story, Orpheus is a vain guy. He's like the rock star with all the air, all the bravado and ego that comes with. But it is a problem for Mitchell, who has audiences that just want to fall in love with their heroes. And Mitchell fixed all that by making him an enormously talented and incurable dreamer. And unlike the world of Disney, that's not all magic, and it takes a toll on those around you. It's another complex relational hook. By portraying Orpheus the way she does, then it lets her explore some stuff about human relationships. And that also leads to a couples comparison. Orpheus is in hell, and he wants to convince Hades to release him and Euripides, and he goes with, you should let us go for love. Don't you remember what it's like to be a young person in love with someone and willing to do anything for them? Now, according to Mitchell, Persephone is partially to blame for her relationship with Hades. Now, she's in a bad situation, to be sure, but drinking herself to death isn't exactly a healthy reaction to that. So Persephone kind of turns to some self-destructive behavior as a way of coping with the relationship with Hades. And so she bears some relationship. But the song that Orpheus sings is so good, it restirs that love between Hades and Persephone. It repairs their relationship for a moment. And it looks like both of them are going to come to grips with their own dysfunctions, that Hades will step out of his mad lust for power, and Persephone will stop out of her self-destructive codependency. And importantly, it is the young couple that can hold up a mirror to the old couple and remind them this is what love really looks like. And the young couple, of course, has their own issues. Orpheus still can't provide. He can't contribute anything to the rent. It's not like Eurydice. He's like, I need you to support me. I'm a helpless female who can't get her own money. She can. It's just not enough. And that is the modern condition for so many people. What Mitchell wants to bring out is that the low-wage workers, it takes more than one income, more than one minimum wage income to get by on. And if you can't make it, you are pushed to do some pretty desperate stuff. That is the basic problem that Eurydice and Orpheus are facing. So both couples have issues, and they need to find a productive way to deal with them. For both of them, love for each other needs to be stronger than the problems that they're facing and pulling them apart. How this plays out, we will get to later. But what I want to say for now is getting to that question lets Mitchell address a very 20th century relationship issue, and none of this would have been an issue for the ancient Greeks. That is a unique edition of Aeneas Mitchell. All right. Major change number 5, the look back. As a quick recap for Virgil, it is an act of dementia. He just goes nuts in the moment, looks back. That's something humans do. Humans screw up, he screwed up. For Ovid, he turns back because of love. For Mitchell, and I will say, any telling of the story, you got to answer the question. Why is it Orpheus turns back? He gets to the edge, he's almost there, and he turns back. And there's some other podcasters I've listened to that are like, because he's an idiot. You should not do that. There needs to be some kind of explanation. This story has been told for 2,000 years and adapted many times, and this is the question you got to answer. And in Mitchell's book, there is clear evidence that she has worked on this, and they struggled with it quite a bit. After the New York Theater Workshop, this became something that they had to work on. They noticed that this was the climax of the show, and it is an abstract thought, whatever it is. Like, is it anxiety? Is it love? Is it the human condition? And that needed to be clarified. Now, it might have been linked to Eurydice walking out on him before. That part of the reason he doesn't trust that Eurydice is following him is that Eurydice has already left him once to go make a deal with Hades. But she writes on page 244, quote, "But there was something not quite right about that angle either. As Andre de Shields put it in a workshop, it had to be doubt with a capital D. It had to be deeper than jealous love. It had to be existential and inevitable," end quote. And then she has another quote later on. "Faced with the final trial of walking and singing alone, he fails because his faith never resided within him to begin with him." That is a quote that comes from page 75 of the book, but then it ends on page 245. Orpheus is given this line, quote, "Who am I to think that I can hold my head up higher than my fellow man," end quote. And then later on that same page, Mitchell writes that this line, that by writing this line, when she put that in the show, she had, quote, "found a way to introduce that motif twice from the mouths of the Fates in Who Are You? Before Orpheus himself utters the line in Doubt Comes In." That gave it a sense of inevitability that we were after, doubt with a capital D, end quote. So why is it, according to Mitchell, that Orpheus looks back? Because he has doubt. That he does not believe in himself, that his faith never resided in him. And I am going to go off of what Mitchell has to say here a little bit. I do think there's a little bit of the performer's dilemma in here. If you're a performer, you need to have enough of an ego to get out there and perform, but you are constantly terrified and unsure of yourself. You're on the stage, you're naked before the audience. If you screw up, they're going to know it. And the flip side of having a whole bunch of people in front of you validating your ego is that they might do the opposite, and that's always a possibility. You need audience reaction for validation, and if you don't get that, you're in trouble. Mitchell in that book has expressed this a couple times, kind of an aside comment. It's not like a central theme that Mitchell talks about a lot, but in a pretty revealing way. She's a folk music performer before she's a Broadway writer. And if you've seen that Neil Diamond musical, it is basically the whole plot that I am a great performer. I've done everything I can do as in performance. I've had #1 hits. I'm the greatest performer of my generation, but I still have this gnawing anxiety all the time that maybe I'm not good enough. Now, maybe I'm trying a little too much to psychoanalyze Mitchell myself, but I do think that's there, that part of why Mitchell relates to Orpheus feeling like maybe he's not good enough is because as a performer, she too has had that feeling. So that is, she has written into the show, he didn't turn back as a dementia. He didn't turn back as a love. He turned back as a loss of faith, and not a loss of faith in Eurydice, but because it reveals that he never had enough faith in himself. And that, I think, does quite a fusion of the different themes in the great books that she'd inherited. For Virgil, the turn is inevitable because of the role that Orpheus had in cosmic fate. The turn was inevitable. He could not do it. He went mad. He's human. They get crushed by the gods. That's what happened to him. For Ovid, he's in love. It's a choice. He's turning on because he is totally in love, and it's a personal human choice. But for Mitchell, it is also inevitable, just like it is in Virgil, but not because of their relationship with the gods, and not because of love, but because of doubt and the location of faith. Orpheus is tragic because he is driven by his talent and not by his faith. He's the charmed boy who can't be anything other than he is. He is the world's greatest musician. the universe's greatest musician. But he's along for the ride as much as anything else. He plays because he's the guitar man. He's always looking for another place to play. But what he's missing is a grounding of himself. And that is a real theme that Mitchell's put in the show. All right. Major change number 6, lift a cup. This is how the show ends. You lift a cup to Orpheus because what is the show? It's a celebration of Orpheus getting up and trying. For Ovid, what Orpheus does, turning back, is forgivable because of love. For Mitchell, it's forgivable because he's going to try again. It's an old song. It is a sad song. It's going to repeat, and it's going to happen over and over. Mitchell lifts the cup to Orpheus and comes down hard on that. You just can't miss it. It's how the show ends. And what's interesting is that's definitely part of the HADESTOWN show, but Mitchell tried to cut it in all performances after the New York Theater Workshop. And what happened was the audiences hated it, and Rachel Chavkin, the director, was always in favor. So I think it's fair to say the story itself, HADESTOWN as an entity and not as a particular creative choice of Mitchell per se, but as a co-creation of Mitchell, the audience, and Chavkin. That's how the show ends. What's the show about? It's about trying again. And I do think that even though Mitchell says she tried to cut it, there's no doubt that that's how she wants to land on it. On page 255, she writes, quote, "We raise our cups to Orpheus, not because he succeeds, but because he tries. We understand implicitly that there's value in him trying again, even if in his future," end quote. There's a tribute to staying in the fight. Is there a tribute to staying in the fight? Yes. Did Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony end sexism? No. But did they make a lot of progress? They did. Did MLK end racism? No. Did he make a lot of progress? Yes. Did Gandhi end all imperialism? No. But those are the 4 people that we remember because they tried and tried and tried, and eventually it worked for them. But how many more names are there out there that we've never heard of that beat their head against the wall again and again and again and didn't get anywhere? What about the Freedom Riders in the 1960s who went down to the South, and all that happened to them was they got killed? Do we say your life was a waste, or do we say we're raising a cup to you because you tried and you kept trying and it didn't work, but you're not giving up? There's so many attempts, right? Even Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony couldn't end sexism. Even MLK couldn't end racism. Even Gandhi couldn't end imperialism. Should we all give up and quit? No. And really, really no. That is the point of the production, and it's bigger than Mitchell. And I do think it's important to note that Mitchell ends her book by linking that theme to her own writing. What is the HADESTOWN version of the Orpheus story about? It's about you keep trying and you celebrate the attempt, not the victory. It's not important that you win. It's important that you try. And for Mitchell, I think this theme rings especially true because she's a writer. What is writing like? Is it because you succeed, because it works? Or does it feel like every single day you're beating your head against the wall? I'm going to end here with a quote from Mitchell's book. "The act of writing for me has most often been a process of failing repeatedly. It's the only way I know how to write. And in the moment of failure at the desk, banging one's head against the wall, it's nearly impossible to see or feel the value in it. But when I step back, I see a different picture. I know that HADESTOWN is, and this goes for any creative endeavor, I reckon, so much more than what meets the eye or the ear. What is seen or heard on stage is the blooming flower, but most of the plant is underground. Every line, verse, or chorus, every idea any of us who worked on it ever had, even the ones that never saw the light of day, they're down there. They're the roots of the plant, and the flower wouldn't exist without them. The one who blooms in the bitter snow bloom because they're supported from below by 1,000 tries and failures. Here's one last example of that." And then she includes the text for "We Raise Our Cups" from the studio album in 2010. And then she concludes, "I'm a little embarrassed by those lyrics, as confused to why Persephone appears to be standing in for Orpheus's mom. But I'm utterly fascinated by that last line, a line that appeared in 2006, disappeared for 10 years, and was reborn in 2016 in Road to Hell as a central theme of the show. The sea lay underground for a decade, and when the conditions were right, it bloomed again. Keep trying," end quote. Oh man, that's part of the reason that I like Aeneid Mitchell, and that helps you understand what she was doing with her story. the trying again. It's a metaphor for writing. It's a metaphor for life. It's a metaphor for change. It is a song that we sing again. Okay, what a journey. We have been through many versions of the story, and the question isn't so much, is Mitchell being true to the original Orpheus story, but how did Mitchell adapt that story to our century, and what did she add to it? What she added was she took flat characters and made them rich while keeping Orpheus at the center of the story, making it the heart of the story, and celebrating the productivity of art and making art change the world. We will dive into all the issues that got raised in this telling of the story in our coming 5 episodes, or not all of them probably, but a whole bunch of them. But for now, let's just appreciate what it was she did. She made some important choices. She took stuff out. She added stuff in that was not there, but she kept the framework of the Orpheus story, and she made Orpheus, the musician, the start of it. She removed what would get in the way, everything before the death of Eurydice, and then she took everything after the look back. She explored the dark spots in human relationships. She looked at the toxic patterns, the compromises, the inevitable conflicts, and the dysfunctions, and linked it to the state of an imaginary world, which we can all see reflected in our own world. She did that so well that reality is imitating her art, with Donald Trump's wall, with the ongoing climate crisis, with the sexual harassment crisis, and the Me Too movement, which has now taken down at least the royalty of England, and it's still not over. There are more things that audience members will find in the show that resonates in enormously powerful ways with audiences. We'll see stuff in there in ways that I could never have predicted, and I'll bet that Mitchell could not have predicted either. We're going to see more stuff come out that the show is relevant to. What Mitchell's done is taken a great story that's been told and retold for centuries, and she's told it in her own very unique way, in her only very unique voice. She has made it relevant for this generation. Okay, we're going to do one more episode on the last creative choice, and then we'll do some deeper dives on the other central themes. Those themes are race, class, and gender, and the environment, but also things like autism and pastoral psychology. Those are all things that others have seen in the show, and they talk about how the show handles them, people who like it and people who don't. We'll do deep dives into that. The big creative choice we'll talk about next time, and that is putting the words of the song that is sung to Hades into the mouth of Orpheus. Now, Mitchell did that, but was hardly the first. In fact, more than one scholar has said that the Orpheus story was what launched the entire genre of opera in the first place. When opera first developed, it developed around the Orpheus story. In fact, there are scholars who think that opera couldn't exist without the Orpheus story. And that combination of taking words and a story and a song, that is central to telling the Orpheus tale. And the next time that we get together, we will do a deep dive into how Mitchell did that. How did Mitchell put the song that moves Hades into the mouth of Orpheus? Well, our series can't be over because it's built on an opera, and the opera isn't over until the fat lady sings, and we will hear her warm up in the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.